composers from the 1580s. So I will hand over to Connor now, who's singing.
So we're going to start with the earliest composer that we're singing today. We're singing two composers, Marco Antonio Ingegneri and Benedetto Pallavicino, both of which are sort of late 16th century composers, famous for their secular music, their madrigals, based in northern Italy. So Ingegneri was, he died in 1592. So right at the end of the century, and we believe he was born as early as 1535. There's not a whole lot that exists about engineering. Gouldstone College actually, here in Cambridge, has recorded a lot of his sacred music, but not a whole lot. In fact, zero recordings exist for his secular stuff, for his madrigals. He's sort of like, we will get onto later on, Pallavicino. He lives in the shadow of the more famous composer Monteverdi, who we'll talk about. But first, we're just going to sing one of his pieces. And also the teacher of the composer we're next going to sing, Pallavicino. Pallavicino, there's a lot more that exists on him for a kind of discourse, a very famous discourse between Pallavicino, Monteverdi, and a theorist of the 16th century called Giovanni Artusi. So Pallavicino, who is going to be the sort of the brunt of this talk, was born a lot later, sort of as he was taught by engineers. So he was born in about 1550, 1551, and died right at the end of the century, 1601. He was situated chiefly in northern Italy, so he popped in and out of Verona, but was mainly working at the court of Mantua for the Gonzaga family, which is a very famous court. The job he actually beat out Monteverdi for. So he was believed by the court to be a better musician at that point in time. He was slightly older than Monteverdi, but there's the assumption that he received a lot of financial support for his music by the Accademia Filarmonica, which was by that point a very well established and probably the most famous kind of, for want of a better phrase, gentleman's club of musicians in Verona. He was extremely prolific. He wrote 10 books of madrigals in his, what would have been about 20-year career. The first book, which we just performed from, was published in 1579, so about 20 years before he died, and he then published 10 books of madrigals. He only published one book of 4 books of madrigals in his lifetime. So, from a historical framework, because as performers we tend to work from history rather than from source. You know, we work from historical documents, scores, editions, these sorts of things, rather than primary sources. How is he understood? He's kind of placed in relation to Monteverdi the entire time. So a fun fact, like on the Wikipedia page for Pallavicino, Monteverdi's name actually comes up more than Pallavicino's name because of how famous Monteverdi really is. In musicology, so in academia, he's understood as inferior, and biographers since about the 1950s within Europe and within England have sort of bashed the guy a bit. They've been quite harsh on him. This started around the kind of explosion of German musicology in the 1950s. So this musicologist called Hans Rebelik writes, "I doubtless recognise Monteverdi's significance. For years he gave preference to such mediocrities as Pallavicino," and he lists a few other people such as Stridio and Pallavicino. That was said in 1955. So we're getting quite scholarly here. How is this relevant to us as performers? Well, the thing is, as I just said, we perform from scores. We perform from critical editions, or we aim to perform from critical editions which have been assembled by these very academics. So it's up to the musicologist to decide very carefully on who they make editions for, because in making editions for, or making 10 editions for one piece of Monteverdi, you kind of ignore other composers which are going on just as famous and might most likely just as good as Monteverdi, essentially. So to us as performers, these decisions that musicologists make, these kind of preferences they choose, are really vital, because we might end up just performing Monteverdi the whole time when there's so many other composers out there. So I just want to talk before we move on to Pallavicino and perform a piece of this, I just want to talk about the Cruda Amarini incident, which is by far and away one of the most famous kind of scholarly incidents within musicology, and Monteverdi and Pallavicino are right at the heart of this, because they were close rivals, which might be a narrative thing, but they were at the time both working in northern Italy, very, very kind of competitive, and it's hard to know who was copying who, but they were stealing each other's musical ideas all the time, particularly within the kind of middle books, or the big books 4, 5, and 6. So the Cruda Amarini incident is a piece which is drawn upon by this theorist I mentioned called Artusi in a 1600 publication, which was labelled Of the Imperfections of Modern Music, which is quite a vague title, but it essentially is condemning the likes of people such as Monteverdi and Pallavicino for their new styles of writing, for their new rules, or at least for the rules they were breaking musically. It's kind of like they were coming over the hammer and sort of, or at least Artusi felt they were coming over the hammer and sort of smashing up the rule books a bit. So a quote from this publication: "They are harsh to the ear, rather than offending and delighting it, and to the good rules left by those who have established the order and the bounds of this science, they bring confusion and imperfection of no little consequence." So big stuff. This publication is centered around a composer, which musicologists assume is Monteverdi, but actually Monteverdi's name is not mentioned at all throughout this entire publication. It's an anonymous composer that's being talked about. This gets especially more difficult, because this is a topic which is regularly attributed to Monteverdi. When you realise that in 1600, in his sixth book of magical, Pallavicino published a Cruda Amarini, which is very dissonant and quite unusual in places musically, alongside Monteverdi's own publication, which arrived in 1605, which is 5 years after the 1600 publication by Artusi. So basically, around the turn of the century, lots of different composers were writing a setting of Pruda Amadin, and this theorist like sort of refrained from saying who he's targeting musically. So basically, a big kind of a massive document from history. Monteverdi's name has just been kind of slightly arbitrarily attached to it because there's no proof that it was actually Monteverdi. It's quite unusual. So musicologically, within the 20th century, this German branch of musicologists saw one theorist, Alfred Einstein, writing that Pruda Amadori by Pallavicino uses tantalizing dissonance. He discusses how sort of harmonically ambitious Pallavicino's work is, and this is prior to everyone kind of attaching Monteverdi's name to the document, to the Artusi sort of scandal. So Einstein, this musicologist, Alfred Einstein, not the scientist, sorry, that would be quite cool. Alfred Einstein is reading, he then reads sort of Sigismondo India's and Monteverdi's settings through Pallavicino's. So he's sort of saying Pallavicino is pioneering a new style here, pioneering a new kind of harmonic and musical language and setting up new rules. And Monteverdi and India and these sorts of composers that are kind of are sort of following them, or rather he's being kind of innovative. And so you've got this massive kind of really famous scandal which has led to like millions of recordings of Monteverdi's and millions of editions of it. And yet we're not even entirely sure, it's a slight historical kind of fabrication as to whether it was actually Monteverdi's work. And so this tiny little kind of epicenter to this whole kind of issue of preference, I guess, or preference is perhaps the wrong word, prioritizing one composer over another, is it's a great indicator of the significance of research alongside performance, because there's 10 books of Pallavicino, and pretty much all of them are unrecorded. There's so much to do. And yet there's so many recordings of Monteverdi, which is nice because he's a good composer. But it's just a case of like not contriving too much historically, or having everything you say backed up with cold hard facts before you get to a point where you can Google the Monteverdi Artusi incident, and there's like 2 million hits that come up, but then you Google Pallavicino and Monteverdi's name comes up. So yeah, sorry, that's perhaps enough for me. Shall we perform some Pallavicino? Hold on, sorry, I'll do something.
Lord.
very polyphonic style to a kind of very textual, dramatic. You can really kind of wrap your mouth around the words in this kind of music. It's so texty. Well, I would say in comparison to Monteverdi, but pretty much all of Monteverdi's work is 5 voices. It would have been lovely to sing some to you today, but you don't have 5 voices here today, unfortunately. But yeah, that's what we.
I'll answer the first question, which is just to pick up on regarding the Artusi situation. Obviously, there was a gap in publications, and Monteverdi's publications are 1587, the first book, 1590, and then 1592, and then there's an 11-year hiatus in 1603, which is a kind of a thing which seems to happen across the board. It happens with Luzzaschi and Gesualdo also in there, between their third and fourth books with Pallavicino, I think, had a slightly different, maybe his fifth book is 1593 and his sixth book is 1600, so it's not quite as long. Is there anything regarding the Artusi correspondence? Is there anything talking about specifics with regard to one composer? Because as far as I'm concerned, from what I've read on this subject, Artusi is in fact mostly referring to modern music, as opposed to a composer, as it were. So he's referring to the art of modern music, but more to the point of how a variety of composers, because Monteverdi was just one of them, who is doing something different, and actually their disengagement, I suppose, with that style, they're not keen on. Is that your reading of that situation?
So he cast a very broad net. In 1605, actually, which is 5 years after, it's a huge gap, 5 years after Artusi's publication, Monteverdi releases his 5th book, which contains his own, which is the first appearance in a publication rather than just manuscripts. Sorry, I should have been clear and said that the way in which Pallavicino and Monteverdi's pieces were disseminating amongst Italy was through manuscripts, not through publications. It would have been sort of quickly sketched out pieces or productions of the work rather than a kind of full-blown print house production. So Monteverdi, the 1605 publication, addresses Artusi's own comments, sort of saying, in a nutshell, sorry, here's what we're doing now. Sorry, you took arms against my Prodan, I believe, essentially, I'm paraphrasing. And Artusi himself comes back, or at least scholars believe Artusi responded, but it's in a pseudonym. I can't exactly remember what name it is, it's kind of irrelevant, but somebody with a completely different name wrote back to Monteverdi. That's the one. And musicologists kind of assume it was Artusi with under a different name, a pen name basically, which is quite interesting. And yet, so the jigsaw puzzles aren't completely fitting together perfectly historically. It's all a lot of like forcing pieces together, like, oh, it's a different person responding, but maybe, we have no reason to believe that it was actually Artusi responding to Monteverdi. It just makes it doubly ambiguous, basically, because Artusi is kind of talking about tons of composers, or as you said, which is arising in the latter half of the 16th century, towards the 16th century.
So you feel in a sense that that's the kind of case, and this is of course not the only case of this, of musicologists fitting something to a narrative in that sense, as opposed to... it happens frequently. It makes for a lovely story, but the lovely story sometimes leads to an over-fixation. At least that's kind of at least a problem I think does occur. I will just say that this is kind of related to the work that we've been doing on Ferrabosco, and of course the bird situation with Ferrabosco in the UK is quite similar in a way, whereby you've got one person who's incredibly famous largely because of the native elements. But this is a very similar situation where you've got a composer who was at the time esteemed in exactly the same sense as Monteverdi, but in history has been pushed to one side to allow for this kind of fixation on a composer who, as you say, is a good composer. But I think it's very important from our perspective that we are true to
what was going on at the time, as it were, and certainly during his time, certainly in the early 1600s, Monteverdi was seen not above any of his contemporaries at that particular time. There were a variety of people, whether that be Ferenczi or just other Tasca, with these kind of guys who were at least on parity in terms of contemporary reputation. So that, I think, is a really, really good point to actually not to look backwards based on what we have currently available, which is a lot of Monteverdi disc and a lot of concert performances, as opposed to Pallavicino, who's never performed. A kind of cool fact actually is that the Pallavicino setting that we just sang, the Non Arco, is ironically related to Ferrabosco, funnily enough. Ferrabosco went back to Italy in 1578 from the UK and was imprisoned in Rome, and then 3 months later was found in Bologna. So he did release from prison. Nobody really knows why that was. But it's a kind of similar situation to the situation with Nicola Conde in the 1540s, where he was on a ship and then suddenly he was supposed to be doing work in the galleys on the ship, and he wrote eight Magnificats and they let him go free because it was very amazing. So the Ferrabosco got a 3-year sentence in 1578, and 3 months later was parading around in Bologna. So obviously they took that incredibly seriously. But in 1579, Pallavicino publishes this first book of madrigals, and the first text in the book is this Non Arco in Sottovoce. And it's a direct correlation to a piece by Ferrabosco which is unpublished. And it's the only setting of this text. It's a text by a chap called Anselm Francesco Doni, who's also wrote the treatise 20 years earlier. And there are no settings of this text by any other composers across the entirety of the 16th century, just Ferrabosco and Pallavicino. And in that kind of, when you have such clear concordances, there's only one assumption that can be made from that, that is that one knew the other. Because it's so rare that you find two concordances so close to each other in terms of date that one would not have known the other, and yet would have chosen to set the same text. So it's also quite a fascinating kind of, you find that these top composers, when you start looking into it, they actually are inherently linked. Very, very close. Yeah, indeed. Does anybody have any kind of thoughts or questions from outside on this? I'm going to have a little bit of a chat about that.
Yeah, I mean, that Artusi conjunction is such a fascinating insights into the times and priorities. I've always wondered, what kind of music is Artusi prefer? Do we get a sense that rather than the kind of new modern music, does he have an idea of what he'd rather have before he into the work?
Pallavicino type counterpoint, or that's the easiest stereotype to put to.
It's definitely he points to theory from Zarlino. So it's definitely to do with counterpoint and the rules of counterpoint, which effectively is to do with direct dissonance by and large. So
it's sort of, I was about to say, your bread and butter kind of, I don't want to say boring, but kind of bread and butter contrapuntal, that's a wrong term, polyphonic kind of rules. Pallavicino, not him, just something. Palestrina, Willard, these sorts of the composers from the lowlands, and also the Venetian schools of Palestrina, which is Zarlino cites.
I think when you're seeing the kind of two different styles, it's also looking more at music that's kind of earlier 1540s to about 1560s. The way you're seeing it for those kind of the contrapuntalists and the style that Artusi is looking back at and venerating is very much more the style where the words are very much second to the melody. So you're, as a singer, your aim is to sing the melody in one breath, and you're just thinking about your line. Whereas something like Pallavicino, the words are so much more important and they are more dictating the music.
It's an endemic societal change, I think, as well, because it's not too dissimilar to the kind of literary questions that they were asking about whether they were forgetting what Edward was speaking at a symposium on Saturday, and so was worried about literary forms with regard to poetic structure and things like that, and whether it was deemed as important or whether they were just interested in word painting, effectively. And that's something which definitely comes to the fore in the kind of latter 16th century, whereby the notion of form and structure within the madrigal, within all of the kind of long form, the sestinas, the canzones, the capitolas, these kind of things, they were all thrown out the window for effectively one verse poems, whereby you could get across a sentiment in a very, very short space of time. And inevitably, alongside that comes a shift in the way that one composes, because one has less time to get to one's point. So you have to get to it in a more instantaneous and dramatic kind of fashion, which is what Monteverdi is kind of famous for doing in his book 4 or 5, is that you get there very quickly. Ironically enough, the Pallavicino setting is, it starts with semitone dissonance. Yeah. So that moment, it's about, on the word crula, just creating something which instantaneously represents the word crula. He's not interested in form at all, it's to do with representing that particular word Victoria. So it's definitely related as a societal thing.
I always struck me that he referred to, in his criticism, that it was breaking the rules of this science, which is a rather sort of medieval one.
Yeah, sure.
As a branch of science.
I think as Warwick said on Saturday in Symposium, that music goes, or kind of the shift in the 15th century, so music goes from being viewed as a science to being viewed as an art. And then you can see that reflected. So it's
very fascinating time. I've never really kind of like, it's all tightly woven mathematical music, which you just listen to.
I think it must be a very strange kind of circumstance. It's something which we, of course, can't relate to, but the notion of living through something like that, whereby you're of an older generation and then something like that comes along. Naturally, you pine a little bit for the thing which one has grown up with. And Artusi, of course, would have grown up with the 1560s, and even in the 1560s, at the end of the madrigal had not taken off to the same extent. It was very much still music for musicians in that sense. There was less commerciality to it. It was sung in academic, what we would call academic circles in a way. So a little bit like it might be here, for example, whereby you've got a very, very small audience who are educated to a certain level and have a certain type of understanding, etc., as opposed to this kind of notion of putting it out to the world, where we would do with the Monty Vespers or something like that, whereby it's a performance. You very rarely see Monteverdi Vespers perform to 3 people, as it were. It's the kind of packed out concert hall vibe that it's going for nowadays, which is an entirely different world, and one that Monteverdi kind of inhabits relatively well. Pallavicino, of course, doesn't really get there. And I think there's another interesting facet to that, which is that the sacred and the secular, in terms of what they're famous for, is also something which is historically represented. So I've noticed recently that, for example, people like Felice and Elio, who I've sung a lot of Elio's sacred music, and it's very much of the prima classica style, and it's very, to be perfectly honest, it's Palestrinian, but maybe not quite to the same level. I would go as far as to say some of it's garbage, really, to be perfect. It's mediocre composition, and then we sung his madrigals, which he is not famous for the other day, and they are first rate. So it's quite fascinating that somebody who is revered as a sacred composer, in terms of contrapuntal abilities, clearly, if you were to analyse that vertically, you would find that the far more interesting stuff is actually going on in the secular music. But he only published it at the start of his career, and then as soon as he was in the Julian chapel, much like Palestrina actually, they then didn't publish anything secular at all. So secular music was not something which they were allowed to touch, and obviously what people are wanting in the daily liturgy in the Sistine Chapel or the Julian Chapel is likely to be different from a kind of dissonance treatment perspective to something that we might want in a setting like this.
What about the economics then of that? Who paid what for what?
Yeah, so
who, the church paid for the sacred music, simply?
Yeah.
Or was that being kind of?
No,
What were the economics of madrigals? Who bought them?
Well, it's a fascinating
Why would you
thing.
buy them?
Well, you've got the two strands of this, I suppose, which is one is that you've got the patron. So Monteverdi and Pallavicino are both employed by the Gonzagas, and the court of Mantua paid them a salary, as it were. So they were on salary, so they were on retainer.
Is that like a vanity? The patron has this stuff coming out as a vanity or legacy thing for their own purposes?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think is actually not talked about in the musicological circles is whether or not that's the case. We don't actually know the answer to that question. It's quite an interesting one, but these gaps in publication history, whereby you get like 11 years, whereby somebody's employed by a certain patron and nothing comes out in 11 years, one can only surmise from that effectively that amounts to the same thing as copyright in today's society, whereby that person owns the material that's coming out from the pen of the composer until the point that they left the service, in which case, it becomes fair game for commercial.
There are also quite a lot of examples of, especially, or at least as far as I'm aware, all the books I've looked at in some text are English, where you get composers dedicating books and matchbooks to a patron in the hope that that patron will then take them on and essentially pay retroactively to the cost.
Yeah, and actually that first book by Pallavicino is dedicated to the Academy, so that might go in the hope that they would pay for it, basically. So it's a very strange kind of structure. They send it to the Academy, and it's one of the really interesting things actually about these kind of academies is that they were sent music, and then 5 of them would sit around and they would judge the music. They would sing it through and they would judge it, and then if it was judged positively, they would pay the composer, and if it was judged negatively, then they wouldn't pay them. And in paying, they then also gave credence to the fact that they were allowed to put it in the title page. So the dedication was then allowed to be printed in the title page. And they paid them in a variety of ways. They sometimes paid them gold medals, they sometimes paid them all kinds of different payments in kind. But having a dedication also gave it a kind of level of cachet, I suppose, in that sense as well.
So it wasn't the wider public buying any sort of music, paying any money for music?
I mean, it's hard to kind of know the exact figures on that, because the composers who sold the most copies in the latter 16th century are a lot of the time not composers who we know at all today. So people like Castro, who there's a few kind of sessions on this concept, was one of the most famous composers in the entirety of Europe in terms of commercial sales of publications, and yet he never held an established position at any court throughout his entire career. So a lot of that probably comes down to what was able to be performed. So some of this music is very difficult. So performance by amateurs is going to be very difficult to achieve. So it's not going to hold the same value as, for example, stuff which is a little bit easier to come off the page, which people can get their teeth into. If you want to sell something to the public, you need people to buy it, and people need to be able to manage what is in the publication if they're going to buy it in that sense. So it's two, in a way, it's two different worlds. You've got the kind of world of the music for musicians, which is kind of the high art, as we might call it, I suppose, whereby it's patronised and people sit there and they appreciate it for
And then the pop culture.
And then the pop culture, yeah, in a sense. Which is not too dissimilar. It's not really changed to theirs.
I think there's also, or at least in London, at kind of the same kind of time, there was more, because London was growing, there was just more business class type of people. You get the rise in the publication of books in London at this time, at the same kind of time period, but it's kind of a bit the same as kind of the whole kind of Victorian era society change in terms of just you get to middle business class coming through more, you have more expandable income, and because they want to move with the high art and the high courts and getting the books just easy to.
Speaking of England, actually, the fascinating thing is in the early 17th century, you get this kind of huge rise in Italian madrigals appearing in English anthologies, and generically, across the board, it's the lighter Italian forms, the canzonette, the Napolitane, these kind of forms which, to be perfectly honest, they're dead easy to perform. They're the ones which gain traction in terms of the commercial.
They're quite complex, aren't they?
Yeah, they're easy, they're also rubbish.
Yeah.
It's stuff which anybody can do, so we as musicians get very high and mighty about the fact that it's very, very easy, anyone they have their value in terms of it's something which is really enjoyable to listen to. They're very constant and kind of diatonic, yeah, nice to listen to. They sound very major and happy a lot of the time. And they also work very well with instruments. So you can play them on viols, you can play them with consorts.
So you can dance.
So you can dance, exactly that. So the dance music kind of gained traction, and this music, which is effectively largely about love and loss, which is also a deep and meaningful topic which not everybody wants to dive into every minute of the day, is also, it kind of loses favour in a sense, and it goes out of fashion, and then by the early 17th century, the madrigal dies a death in that sense. In England, there's like 20 years worth of madrigal production where they go crazy for it, and then it dies a death here too, because they know you can't take it any further.
Is that how short it was?
Yeah. So if you discount Bird, who's the most surprising madrigal, like three consort songs, the first publication you're talking about really 1590. The music translation is 1588. And then once you get the other side of 1610, starts to decline. Latest one is 1624. You know, that's in between 1610 and 1624, they're less than 10. Between 1590 and 1610, there's so many in a short space of time, probably 50 or so publications in that period of time. So it's really is tasting its own English form. But they're also, if anybody knows the English madrigals, they're also a lot lighter. So the English madrigals are very light on the tongue. They're very kind of the topics are not deep in that sense. They're light genre. They've kind of taken a lot of them from the canzonetti, of the Italian canzonetti, and it's probably to do with society in that sense. In a domestic environment where everyone wants to dance or to have a bit of fun, they're much more appropriate. And they're also easier